Hello, ladies and gentlemen across the plane. Welcome to the Morgile channel on YouTube. This is the top 5 reasons the heliocentric model falls flat on its face, pun intended, and is an epic failure. And just a quick rundown before we get started. Number 5 would be the Moon. Number 4 would be Polaris. Number 3 would be the inner solar system. Number 2 would be the Jeranism effect. And number 1, orbital mechanics and gravity in general. So, hello and welcome everyone again to the Morgile channel on YouTube. YouTube is of course the place where honest, independent content creators go to die. Just kidding, love you YouTube. Anyway, today we're going to examine the top 5 reasons the heliocentric model is an epic failure, falling flat on its face under every instance of logical scrutiny. Although it is widely believed and dearly beloved to scientists and science fiction fans alike, the heliocentric model and the Copernican version of the universe isn't even close to a viable explanation of observable reality. So prepare to be amazed at how preposterous the accepted model of the universe and the solar system and the galaxy actually is. So starting with number 5, the Moon. Tonight, as I write this, that was 4/28/17. That would be April 28th, 2017. The moon is, or was, 6% illuminated, and the sunset for me was about 8:11 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, and it was exactly 8:35 p.m. as I typed that, and the crescent moon was currently dozens of degrees above the horizon, and I continued documenting the moon that night to see how long after sunset the waxing crescent moon would be visible. And of course I checked timeanddate.com. It said that it should be visible till about 10:46 p.m. I have a tree line in the way from my line of sight, which obscures about maybe, I don't know, 4 or 5 degrees of space, of course, towards the horizon. Anyway, so the crescent moon, by the way, should be aligned to the day side of the Earth exclusively, and certainly shouldn't be visible after sunset. But amazingly, I was able to view the 6% crescent moon until about 10:30 or so, when it, went behind the tree line in my line of sight towards the west, of course. A few weeks ago, I was able to observe a 3% crescent moon for about 2 or 2.5 hours after sunset. And again, that's more or less due to the tree line that obstructs my view to the west. So anyway, the moon set most recently the 6% waxing crescent moon, which was again Friday, April the 28th, 2017, at around 10:15 p.m. Although from my vantage point that was due to that tree line, and according to timeanddate.com, again, the moon, the 6% crescent moon, should have set around, I think it was 10:47 p.m. for my location, which is in South Carolina. Now, we've all observed the moon for the majority of our lives, some of us more intimately and frequently than others, but we can all agree on certain characteristics and patterns of the moon. Assuming a spherical Earth, you have XYZ axis that you can sort of use to describe visible space during the nighttime, and of course the Y and Z axis would be sort of, I guess you could say, infinite, or you can see the stars anywhere that's within the realm of the Y and Z axis, as long as it's above the ground. And so that x-axis, the vertical axis, as that goes beneath the ground, then anything beneath that point, in space, can no longer be seen. Now, I think that this sort of optical illusion is what has misled a lot of astronomers to assume sort of a celestial dome or a celestial sphere is because of the way that the stars behave. Astronomers assume that the stars are extremely distant and it is us that is spinning and the stars are all around us, and so that's why it appears that some stars will nearly touch the horizon at times. Although on a flat Earth model, on a stationary plane Earth model, you have the same sort of situation where you've got this X, Y, and Z axis where anything above ground can be seen on the, those X and Z axis. Anything below that point of the ground on the Y axis, everything would be obstructed in terms of line of sight towards visible space. And so what causes the apparent celestial dome or celestial sphere in the flat Earth reality is the operation of perspective, as well as atmospheric lensing, which we will get into in a bit, but it's a fundamental premise to get out of the way real quick that assuming that the Earth is a sphere, your line of sight towards visible space is going to be a tangent to the curve of the Earth. And that tangent line is going to diverge from the curvature very quickly, especially quickly the lower you are in altitude. So if you're standing 6 feet above sea level, assuming you're standing, at sea, your apparent horizon is about 3.5 miles away. And so any stars that are so laterally distant on the flat Earth that appear to be nearly touching the horizon are actually nowhere near the horizon. It is actually just the operation of perspective which causes them to appear near the horizon, near the vanishing point, if you will, although the stars are on a much further removed plane than the Earth plane, but we will get into that in a bit. Again, the way that this is explained, or the way that this works in flat Earth, is you still have a optical horizon or a vanishing point all around you, even assuming the Earth to be a plane, and again that is simply due to the operations of perspective. You cannot see to infinity on the plane just simply due to our eyes and the way that they're made up. Our eyes are not capable of seeing angles of a certain minuteness, and once an object gets beyond the optical vanishing point, it will begin to get so small that at some point it will become invisible or obstructed by the horizon itself. Either that or the atmosphere itself will become so opaque that the object is no longer visible. So there are several different things that factor into not being able to see to infinity upon the plane Earth. However, the idea of a celestial dome, because the stars appear to come near the horizon, is rather ridiculous, as if you are to travel, say you're at the North Pole and the North Pole star is 90 degrees overhead, and the equatorial stars are obviously going to be very close to the horizon, if not obscured by the horizon itself from the North Pole. However, if you were to travel to that point, then of course those stars are going to be overhead and the North Pole will seem to be near the horizon. And this has nothing to do with a spherical Earth or stars surrounding us. It has to do with the stars being fixed to a single plane, or at least apparently fixed to a single plane, and they are much closer and smaller than we've been told. This makes perfect sense. It is the operations of perspective in play, although it is sort of hard to wrap your brain around because you're dealing with a plane of lights, which the source of the lights is truly unknown in terms of the stars, but they are definitely there. But a plane of lights that this plane is removed from our plane of existence by any, maybe hundreds of miles or thousands of miles or more, and it's hard to sort of conceptualize how a star that is, say, 3,000 miles high appears to be near the horizon according to your perspective. And I think that atmospheric lensing has a lot to do with this, but we'll get into all of that in a little bit more detail. I just wanted to make the point that your line of sight on a hypothetical spherical Earth is a tangent to that curve, whereas on a flat Earth your line of sight becomes convergent with the horizon and the sky plane at two different distances. So your ground horizon is about 3.5 miles away if you're 6 foot tall, although those stars, which are nearly touching the horizon, are much further away laterally than 3.5 miles, which sort of makes perfect sense if you assume that the stars are fixed to a plane far removed from our plane, and there's no need for hypothetical Earth spinning or Earth orbiting in order for this to work. And in fact, there's really not necessarily any need for hypothetical star orbiting for this to work, and we'll touch on that as well, but it has to do with the rotational vortex magnetic field that the Earth generates could be sufficient to cause the illusion of star rotation, although that is just theory. The stars very well may be physical objects orbiting the sky central to Polaris. In terms of the moon, as much as we believe we know about the moon and its phases and its orbit, indeed it is one of the most interesting and mystifying celestial bodies, which certainly defies the conventional explanations for a variety of obvious reasons. For one thing, the moon appears to be about the same size as the sun, which is an astronomically unlikely coincidence according to the heliocentric model, where these two different objects, the sun and the moon, are wildly different in terms of size as well as distance, but sheer lucky chance in the chaotic random universe, our sun and moon were placed at the precise distance according to their size to cause them to appear nearly identical in angular size under most circumstances. Now, for an in-depth look at just how unlikely this whole scenario is as a result of random chance, check out the Globe is Dead 4, or you can watch the whole 5-part series, but I'll put a link to those, or a card to those here, and a link in the description. Suffice to say that the moon's phases are a direct result of its position relative to the sun, according to the mainstream theoretical physical explanation of the solar system. Since the moon itself is supposedly orbiting the spherical Earth along the ecliptic plane, plus or minus 5 degrees, we can determine exactly where the moon should be relative to the sun and the Earth based on its current phase alone, to a very high degree of accuracy, even through just estimation. In reality, certain observations of moon phases during key times place the moon where it technically couldn't possibly be if the heliocentric model was correct. To be clear on this point, the full moon phase necessarily places the moon on the complete opposite side of the Earth relative to the sun, while the no moon phase places the moon in alignment with the Earth and the sun in between them, so in alignment with the sun according to an observer on Earth. The two half-moon conditions would place the moon either east or west of the Earth's alleged path around the sun. Now, we'll cover this in a little bit more detail in the final section regarding orbital mechanics, but the duration between each half-moon phase is pretty much identical a simple fact which contradicts the heliocentric theory completely, where gravity and orbital velocity are the only variables involved with the moon's orbital trajectory. In order for the moon to remain at a constant or more or less constant velocity relative to the Earth, as the Earth is supposedly in high velocity in motion around the Sun, the moon would necessarily accelerate far faster than the Earth's velocity to travel along the eastward path past the Earth from a half moon west of the Earth's trajectory, we'll call that half moon A, towards the half moon east of the Earth's trajectory, we'll call that half moon B. However, during the transition from half moon B back towards A, heading west, then the moon would necessarily decelerate to compensate for the Earth allegedly traveling, eastward at 66,600 miles per hour. Now, you can practically say that the Sun, Earth, and Moon are in direct alignment in that order during the full moon phase, although the Moon is allegedly misaligned to the ecliptic by a mere 5 degrees maximum. Now, it is claimed that lunar eclipses, they are extremely rare due to this offset, this 5-degree offset orbital plane of the Moon relative to the ecliptic of the Earth, or the Earth's ecliptic plane. But this really doesn't seem logically feasible for a few reasons. While the Moon allegedly orbits the Sun along a plane 5 degrees offset from the ecliptic, the Moon would spend a great deal of time within the approximate alignment to the ecliptic plane based on simple logic. Now, if you can imagine the Moon traveling along its 5-degree divergent orbital plane relative to the ecliptic once per month, it would peak at a mere 5-degree divergence at opposing divergence points, maxing out at 5 degrees on either side of the Earth twice per month, once north of the ecliptic and once south of the ecliptic. Such a 5-degree divergence would be the maximum extreme on either end of the Moon's orbital path, but the Moon would spend a great deal of its time within the mean area surrounding the ecliptic. Furthermore, the phases of the Moon should phase through such a constant realignment of the Moon's alleged orbital divergence from the ecliptic, yet we don't see that. So in other words, since the hypothetically spherical Earth is supposedly in curvilinear motion around the Sun, the phases of the Moon are necessarily variable to the periods of perfectly timed cyclical alignment, more reliable than a fine-tuned watch. So one month the waning crescent moon may be aligned to the ecliptic, and another month the waxing half moon may be aligned to the ecliptic. According to the heliocentric model, this should be a variable thing, and of course the conditions necessary for a lunar eclipse are quite simple. The Moon must be nearly aligned to the ecliptic during the full moon phase, which should logically occur rather frequently, or at least more frequently than solar eclipses, which involve a more complex set of conditions to occur in terms of comparing a lunar eclipse to a solar eclipse according to the heliocentric model, of course. Furthermore, the shadow allegedly cast by the Earth upon the Moon, supposedly causing lunar eclipses, such a shadow, coming from the Earth should be at least 8,000 miles wide, if not greater, while the Moon is only about 2,000 miles wide, allegedly, orbiting the Earth in a near-perfect alignment to the ecliptic. The conditions to create a lunar eclipse in the heliocentric model are simple. The Moon must simply be aligned to the ecliptic plane, or, even pretty closely aligned to the ecliptic plane. It doesn't have to be right on the money logically. Of course, they claim that it does, but The moon just has to be aligned to the ecliptic plane during the full moon phase, and that's the condition necessary to create a total lunar eclipse. Now, again, the shadow of the Earth should be at least as wide as the Earth itself, or greater than the Earth itself, logically, and therefore we should expect to see lunar eclipses more frequently than solar eclipses. Of course, the sun is supposedly aligned to the ecliptic plane according to an observer on the Earth, since the moon is on an alleged path from Capricorn to Cancer and back once per month due to its offset from the ecliptic. Also, the sun seemingly travels from Capricorn to Cancer and back over the course of a year, of course, hypothetically due to the Earth's axial tilt. That's what allegedly causes this in the heliocentric model. Now, with that theory in mind, where the moon is offset to the ecliptic, therefore traveling from Capricorn to Cancer and back apparently, and the Earth is tilted, thus causing the apparent travel of the sun from Capricorn to Cancer and back over the course of a year, as opposed to a month for the moon. You have a more complex set of variables involved with a solar eclipse. Yet, over a 100-year period, you will see roughly the same number of solar and lunar eclipses, which is not good evidence for the heliocentric model. It disagrees with the heliocentric model. Now, since solar and lunar eclipses are essentially identical in number over the course of 100 years, and occur in predictable, regular intervals, predictable patterns, that is also extremely damning evidence against the heliocentric hypothesis, simply because of the chaotic nature of the heliocentric model itself. Really, how could you have perfectly repeating cycles of the heavens and eclipses when there's just so much motion and chaos and unknown variables involved with the heliocentric model itself? You've got the alleged gravitational pull of the galactic center, the alleged gravitational pull of the sun and Jupiter and the Earth and the moon, and you've got acceleration of the sun in terms of traveling in a constant speed along a curved linear path. You've got the sort of unknown trajectory of the galaxy itself, or the at least unfathomable velocity and trajectory of the galaxy itself, all hypothetically. And not to mention, everything in space is supposedly either orbiting our galactic center or expanding in all directions as the result of the Big Bang Theory, yet we have constant, predictable cycles that you can basically set your watch to. Actually, the natural cycles are more precise than the human constructs or quantification of time, which is why we have things like leap year and daylight savings and all that nonsense. But sort of straying off topic a bit, the point is that perfect, predictable cycles of the heavens are an extremely unlikely and damning bit of evidence against the heliocentric hypothesis itself. Now, in terms of the lunar eclipse, we really should see them very frequently because of the simple conditions involved. Again, all that a lunar eclipse takes is for the moon to be even closely aligned, even close to an alignment with the ecliptic during the full moon phase. And quite frankly, that should be extremely likely, far more likely than a solar eclipse. The notion that the Earth's shadow diminishes in size as it approaches the moon to explain away the rarity of lunar eclipses is absolutely ridiculous. Just as the moon's shadow diminishing in size as it transits the sun, according to an observer on the Earth during a solar eclipse, that is also ridiculous according to the heliocentric model. because, you know, in reality, you can never demonstrate a shadow becoming smaller than the cross-section of the object that is obscuring a light source. Either the shadow will be the exact size of the cross-section of the object obscuring the light source, or the shadow will be of a greater radius than the cross-section of the object obscuring the light source. But shadows simply do not diminish, especially, you know, when you're dealing with a single distant light source such as the sun, hypothetically. So the idea that during the conditions that would be conducive to a total lunar eclipse, unfortunately that doesn't happen very often, because somehow by some miracle of alliance, the Earth's shadow allegedly diminishes in size as it approaches the moon, which is the opposite of what you should expect. Of course, they invent scientifical nonsense, such as the penumbral convergence of sun rays, or whatever that condition is called, where the sun's rays converge at some point in between the sun and the Earth, and thus causing a convergent shadow of the moon or of the Earth. However, this claim of science to explain away why the moon's shadow is so small during a lunar eclipse and the Earth's shadow is apparently so small, according to their ridiculous model, they had to invent the very claim where you've got this sort of convergence of sun rays to produce these sort of focal point shadows, which are just total nonsense, debunks the other claim of alliance that the sun rays are coming in at perfectly parallel lines from the sun to the Earth. If that was indeed the case, then the shadow of the Earth would be at least the diameter of the Earth and would not diminish in size proportionally with distance away from the Earth. I mean, really, how can the sun rays be coming in at perfect parallel lines towards the Earth and at the same time also be converging and diverging at some point between the sun and the Earth in order to form these ridiculously thought out pinpoint shadows which do not occur in reality? Certainly not under natural circumstances. Perhaps some scientists can use laser beams to create a situation where a shadow gets smaller than the cross-section of the object obstructing it, but as far as I know, and any practical experiment that pretty much anyone can do with light and shadow shows that, again, an object casting a shadow will not produce a shadow that diminishes in size. Now, that's sort of a logical fantasy that is cooked up by globe heads in order to theoretically justify their position and apologize for peculiar facts. For example, the moon can somehow cast a shadow that's typically about 50 miles in diameter during a total solar eclipse. Although there are other times that are on record where the moon cast a shadow as little as 2 miles in diameter during a solar eclipse. That's on historical record. So I'm really sort of confused, not by the idea that Alliance is claiming. I'm confused at how the moon can cast a shadow that's sometimes 50 miles in diameter, sometimes 2 miles in diameter during solar eclipses, when technically the moon should cast shadows that are at least 2,000 miles in diameter, simply because the moon is allegedly 2,000 miles in diameter. Again, this is due to the sort of law of lights and shadows that an object obstructing a light source is going to make a shadow that's at least as large as that object. or at least as large as the cross-section of the object that's being obscuring the light. And of course, since we're assuming that the moon is a sphere, then any cross-section of it is going to be exactly the same. Therefore, you would expect a 2,000-mile shadow of the moon on the Earth during every solar eclipse. That's what you should expect, at least 2,000 miles in diameter. Really, the shadow from the moon should expand out as it goes towards the Earth, and if you sort of take this at face value and forget the pre-numberal and post-numberal effects of the convergent sun rays or whatever, just put that on the back burner for a minute. Just think of essentially an infinitely distant light source, the sun, that is exactly the same angular size as the moon, according to an observer on Earth. When the moon obscures the sun or transits the sun, you would expect that shadow to cover really probably the entire face of the Earth facing the sun, quite frankly, just due to the way that shadows expand and sort of get fainter as they gain distance from the obstruction creating the shadow. But even in a worst case scenario, the shadow of the moon should be the same size as the moon, cross-section wise, so 2,000 miles in diameter. That's what it should be. Yet, throughout history, again, the shadow of the moon is a pinpointer, according to Lyons, that ranges in size from usually about 50 miles down to on record as small as 2 miles in diameter. So chew on that and try to figure out how a 2,000-mile diameter object can cast a shadow that's 50 miles in diameter, or 2 miles in diameter. And here are 3 instances where solar eclipses had the moon casting a shadow of 2 miles in diameter or less. That'd be January 3rd, 1927, May 20th, 1966, and May 9th, 1948. Now, for some reason, the moon rarely falls within the sufficient tolerances of the ecliptic plane during the full moon phase to result in a lunar eclipse, which is strange. I mean, we really should see lunar eclipses very, very frequently compared to solar eclipses, especially. Again, as the fundamental layout of the Earth and Moon and Sun should naturally create the conditions necessary for a lunar eclipse far more frequently than what we see in reality. In reality, an object shadow will be at least as large as the object. We're talking about a sphere, hypothetically. So it should be at least as large as the cross-section of the object obscuring the light source. And when you're dealing with hypothetical spheres, then of course that cross-section of anything spherical will be uniform, regardless of the angle of the light source, thus rendering a perfectly circular, or rather divergent conical shadow. Right, so for example, a long cylindrical object can cast essentially no shadow when the light source is maybe at a distance or aligned to the cylinder, obscuring the light. Hence, the shadow in that case would be smaller than the cylindrical object itself. Right, so technically speaking, although that shadow would be at least the same size or larger than the cross-section of the cylinder obstructing the light source. So I'm just sort of covering my bases here, because if I say that shadows can't be smaller than the objects casting the shadows, then of course people will say, well, what if you put a stick in the ground and put a light above it? Then the shadow is smaller than the stick in the ground. But so we're talking about the cross-section of the object, and if you're hypothetically talking of a sphere, then that cross-section is going to be the same regardless of the angle that you're pointing the light from. Right, so now that we've gotten that sort of caveat out of the way, shadows are always at least the same size as the object casting them, and will often create conical shapes that are expanding away from the obstruction. For the heliocentric team to claim that shadows diminish in size, but only in their ridiculous, preposterous model is just a signature sort of bullshittery coming from lions. The very thing, and I already mentioned this, but the very thing contradicts itself. Their own claims contradict themselves. And that's a telltale signature sign of a lie or a misunderstanding. Because again, they say that in order for Eratosthenes' experiment to work, where he so-called proved the sphericity or the circumference of the Earth, what is necessary for that flagship cornerstone experiment to work is that the sun be almost infinite, basically infinitely distant, with nearly perfectly parallel sun rays hitting the Earth at, perfectly parallel angles uniformly across the entire face of the Earth. That's the only way that Eratosthenes' value, which is accepted today more or less, the only way that it works is with that condition of the sun. So they can't say that is a proof of a spherical Earth and say that the moon casts really quite tiny shadows because of this convergence and divergence of sunlight at some point between the sun and the Earth. You can't have your cake and eat it too, right? And that's one thing that you find with the heliocentric theory, just in spades, is contradictory instances where, sorry to say, globetards try to have their cake and eat it too, right? So another example would be the Coriolis effect. Globetards claim that the atmosphere to the Earth is tattooed to the Earth. So the atmosphere 100 feet above the equator is spinning, a little faster than 1,037.5 miles an hour. And the atmosphere 10,000 feet above the equator is spinning, quite a bit faster than 10,037.5 miles an hour. Because, of course, the atmosphere way up here, 10,000 feet high, is traveling a further distance over the same amount of time, right? That, if you measure that arc, it's much longer than that arc over the same amount of time. So the atmosphere must somehow be stuck to the Earth beneath it. That is a claim of globe earthers. That's how they make the flights conundrum work, where eastbound flights are identical in duration to westbound flights when all the destinations are racing towards the east. So westbound flights should be very short and breezy, easy breezy flights, since they're racing towards destinations which are racing towards them. However, globeheads of course say that the atmosphere is tattooed to the Earth, therefore the identical flight times is not a problem. Although, even if the atmosphere were tattooed to the Earth, the relative speed between a plane traveling west and the destination traveling east would be a far greater relative speed compared to a plane traveling east racing against its destination. So anyway, the whole reason I got off on this tangent was to explain why globeheads claim that the atmosphere is tattooed to the Earth. Now, on the other hand, they also claim that the Coriolis effect is responsible for the counter-rotational vortices in terms of hurricanes and typhoons north or south of the equator. So basically what that means is that the atmosphere is not tattooed or velcroed to the frame of reference with the ground beneath it. Otherwise, you could not have motion of the atmosphere independent or out of whack with the eastward velocity of the ground beneath it. So again, you can't have your cake and eat it too. You can't have the atmosphere velcroed to the Earth and have the Coriolis effect causing the counter-rotation of cyclonic forces in either hemisphere. What actually causes the counter-rotation of cyclonic forces is most likely the sun going round in circles overhead, concentric with the North Pole in most models, causing perturbances in the atmosphere, which creates vortices in either direction of the path of the sun. Makes perfect sense. Furthermore, you can find tons of footage where clouds are moving in one direction at one altitude and moving in the opposite direction at another altitude. So how could the atmosphere be stuck to the rotational velocity of the Earth and be moving in both directions at the same time? It doesn't make any sense. What actually makes sense is that the Earth is stationary and it is the atmosphere that's moving. Now, back on point a little bit with the moon again, convergent shadows, again that would be convergent shadows coming from the Earth or the moon during eclipses, is a necessary illogic, that's illogic, to created in order to bolster beliefs in the Earth transiting the Sun, according to an observer on the moon, during a lunar eclipse. But only on very rare occasions, which is simply not feasible according to the heliocentric model, where the moon should spend the majority of its time, or the majority of its orbital period, more or less aligned with the ecliptic plane, and the full moon should be aligned to the ecliptic plane very often to result in quite frequent lunar eclipses, far more frequent than solar eclipses, of course. But that isn't the case. Again, you get roughly the same number over 100 years of solar and lunar eclipses. So, of course, Lyons had to invent this bizarre hypothesis, which somehow causes the Earth's shadow to become like a pinpointer, which the moon, must sort of transit, I guess you could say, in order to cause a lunar eclipse. But quite frankly, the shadow from the Earth should be a divergent conical shape, and even though the moon is offset by a mere 5 degrees to the ecliptic, the full moon should fall within the Earth's shadow nearly every month. If not every month, I would say at least 7 or 8 months out of the year. It would be a very frequent thing. At least partial lunar eclipses for sure. Even total lunar eclipses should be far more common than we see. And they should also be visible from more than, a 50-mile area. You're talking about an allegedly 2,000-mile diameter object 250,000 miles away casting a shadow on the face of the Earth. And yet that shadow is a pinpoint 50 miles wide, usually down to 2 miles wide. That is really making absolutely no sense whatsoever. And if anyone who continues to believe the sizes and distances proclaimed by the heliocentric model in terms of the sun and the moon, then I'm sorry, but you need to get your head checked or look at the evidence. Again, skeptically. With that being said, the full moon should be about 238,000 miles away from the Earth, opposite the Sun. We have observed and documented countless instances, and you probably have too, throughout our lives, where the 100% full moon is visible overhead during the day, from the day side of the Earth, during broad daylight in many cases, many hours after sunrise. Now, under no circumstances, really, especially from anywhere near the tropics, maybe if you're right at the North Pole, there's room for that if you're at the North Pole, perhaps. But under no circumstances other than that, maybe at the North Pole, during the summer in the North, under no circumstances practically should the full moon phase be visible from anywhere on the Earth during the day. Anywhere in the United States is certainly far south enough away from the North Pole. It's close enough to the tropical area to refute or demolish any possible chance of getting a line of sight towards the full moon phase during broad daylight. Yet such observations are commonplace, they're not contested, and I don't see how people who believe in the globe can possibly argue against this except for refuse to think about it, dismiss it. And I just hope and pray that everybody out there, whether it's you guys watching or just everyone, proves all things to themselves. Because I remember being told when I was young that seeing the full moon phase during the day was supposed to be good luck, according to ancient Native American traditions. I have no idea if that's true, but it did cause me to often try to see if I could find a full moon during the day, and you'll find them all the time if you're looking for them. It's a common thing. And I'll throw up some diagrams in geometry, and maybe I already did, to show you how your line of sight towards the space, towards visible space, should be a tangent to the curve of the Earth. And so once you've theoretically spun around to the day, through from the night through the dawn twilight over to the day side of the Earth, and look up overhead and see the full moon, technically that full moon should be about 250,000 miles below your feet through the Earth. But what difference does that make? If you decide not to think about it, that's okay. Model it out, see if what I'm saying is true, and again I'll put up some diagrams to try to help you visualize it, but it is really quite simple. And this one single fact alone totally refutes the heliocentric model altogether. So really, the next time you're hanging out with your globe-tard friends and it's during the day and you happen to see a full moon during the day, ask them to explain that in their model, and maybe bust out a diagram and show them how they're wrong and how it cannot be contested. Simple geometry. The problem is this observation is simply incompatible with the heliocentric model, and so instead of arguing your points, people will just simply refuse to consider them, unfortunately, under most cases. Now, an explanation is required as to how the full moon is visible overhead when it should be about 250,000 miles underneath your feet through the hypothetical spherical Earth. Again, this would be during broad daylight. How can the moon be overhead when it should be through the Earth underneath your feet? Now, on the other end of this coin, in terms of either crescent moon, the phases surrounding no moon, or the little fingernail moons, the crescent moons, such phases surrounding no moon, we can also determine the exact location of where the moon should be relative to the sun, relative to the sun and the Earth, assuming the heliocentric model for argument's sake. And by the way, I hope that any globeheads out there take the time to consider the flat Earth geostationary model for argument's sake, because I can promise you that if you do this, you're guaranteed that the stationary plane Earth model works logically far better than the heliocentric spinning globe Earth theory. The heliocentric spinning globe Earth theory requires very complex and illogical, non-demonstrable, non-falsifiable pseudoscience in order to accept, and the flat stationary Earth model requires you to merely trust your senses. And again, we'll touch on this a little bit more in orbital mechanics, but let's see, right now I'm facing, let's see, west is that way, so that's east. Right now, I'm in the United States, so I'm supposedly racing that way about 800 miles an hour, give or take. And I'm also dropping down along an inverse square curve at around 100 miles per hour compared to a tangent line from the base point right now. So an hour from now, I'll be about 100 miles lower than I am now, according to a baseline parallel to the ground right now. And furthermore, as I'm doing this, the Earth is also racing at about 66,600 miles per hour that way. And as it does that, the sun that the Earth is also traveling along with is racing at about 500,000 miles an hour that way, around a curve no less. And the galaxy itself, along with the sun and the Earth, is traveling at a couple million miles an hour about that way. So, I mean, I'll tell you, this roller coaster ride of the spinning, orbiting, gyroscopic, spherical Earth sure is a fixed frame of reference if I've ever seen one. The problem is, you can't consider a rotating body traveling along multiple curved linear paths at relatively consistent high velocities a fixed frame of reference. The only time that you can call something a fixed frame of reference is if there is no acceleration involved because of your inertia. So if you're traveling 1,000,000 miles an hour perfectly straight, then you will feel as if you're standing still, assuming you're in a vacuum. Of course, if you were traveling 1,000,000 miles an hour through some kind of atmosphere, you'd burn up, apparently. But assuming you're in a vacuum, you know, the only thing that's felt is acceleration, right? So if you were traveling 1,000,000 miles an hour perfectly straight through a vacuum, and then you decelerated to 500,000 miles an hour, let's say in 10 seconds, then your inertia would basically cause you to split in half, even in a vacuum. I think. Probably something like that would happen. It's sort of irrelevant. It's besides the point. The point is, though, if you were to travel 1,000,000 miles an hour along a curved linear path or a parabolic curve, then you would experience some degree of centrifugal force, which is going to be an acceleration. So by traveling along a curved linear path, you still have acceleration, even if you're traveling at a constant velocity, simply because an object wants to travel in a straight line if it's in motion. Anything preventing that object from traveling in a straight line is going to be an acceleration, even if the object is traveling at a consistent speed. So the point is, if I'm racing that way at 800 miles an hour, that's fine. I'd never feel it, you know. Unless I ran really fast that way and jumped, then I would notice you'd notice a difference. You'd hit the ground and have to roll. Okay, but sitting still, traveling 800 miles an hour that way, that's fine. Unless you add in the fact that I'm allegedly traveling along a curved linear path. Now, again, at my latitude, it amounts to about 100 miles in an hour. If you're at the equator, you'd be going 1,000 miles an hour that way, and dropping, vertically at about 135 miles in 1 hour, compared to a tangent line from this base point. So, as that's going on, and the Earth itself is allegedly traveling along a curved linear path, that would be yet another acceleration, because the Earth isn't supposedly traveling in a straight line as it rotates on an axis. So, just right there alone, you have acceleration, and anything but a fixed frame of reference, especially when you add in the path of the sun at 500,000 miles an hour, and the path of the galaxy at a couple million miles an hour, right? So for scientists to call the spherical Earth a fixed frame of reference is cognitive dissonance. It is scientifical nonsense. It is framing a theory that you refuse to critique in spite of mountains of evidence to refute your theory. For theoretical physicists to call the Earth a fixed frame of reference is thoughtless parroting of ancient theoretical philosophers, like Newton or Copernicus, perhaps. No person in the world has ever experienced accelerations or velocities attributed to the Earth, which is spinning and orbiting, the Sun, which is the Earth is orbiting around and the Sun is traveling at a 6-degree angle to the Earth's path, the galaxy going this way. Nobody's ever experienced that acceleration firsthand. We've been told about these conflicting velocities and accelerations, and yet this is supposed to be a fixed frame of reference. Furthermore, with all of the orbital velocities and galactic frames of reference aside, the simple act of rotating will always cause centrifugal force. And even people like Neil deGrasse Tyson claim that the equator of the Earth is a bit chubbier than the rest of it due to the massive centrifugal force that should be created by an object the size of the Earth rotating once per 24 hours. Now, rotating once per 24 hours is not high in terms of RPMs, which is the first argument that most people will have against this, and it may seem valid. However, the exterior edge of the gyroscope, which the spinning sphere Earth sort of is in theory, it is the outer edge of the gyroscope, that velocity, which is used to factor the centrifugal force. So you could have a rather small gyroscope spinning at very high velocities, and it will generate a great deal of centrifugal force. On the other hand, you can have a very large gyroscope, 8,000 miles in diameter, spinning at very low velocities and create a great deal of centrifugal force. So just the idea of centrifugal force alone, which doesn't exist, should be an acceleration. Now, of course, we allegedly have gravity that is the centripetal force to counterbalance the centrifugal force of the spinning of the Earth. Yet, that cannot be detected, measured, felt, proven, demonstrated in any sort of way. And the simplest answer to this question is that the Earth is not rotating, and nor is it a sphere. We're talking very basic Occam's razor stuff here. The proofs are so plentiful that the Earth is not a spinning sphere. It's really hard to name them all, but we'll continue on with the top 5. Now, the moon, the no-moon phase, would necessarily place the moon in direct alignment with the sun and the Earth, according to an observer on the Earth, although that pesky 5-degree offset of the moon's alleged orbital path divergent from the ecliptic plane prevents solar eclipses from occurring more frequently. One point to keep in mind, though, is that according to accepted observations, when the moon is totally invisible, then it must be in direct alignment with the sun. Whether or not it's aligned with the sun on the ecliptic, it would be aligned with the sun according to an observer on the Earth. And that is the condition necessary for no moon. Now, the crescent moon phases leading up to and away from no moon necessarily place the moon just slightly east or west of the sun. Now, in truth, if you think about this logically, the crescent moon phases should strictly be a daytime phenomenon, yet anyone and everyone can see and attest to the fact that the slightest phases of the moon, even 3% full crescent moons, can be seen many hours after sunset. I've documented a few in the last few months myself. The same impossible geometry applies here in terms of the crescent moon, as these phases of the moon should be aligned, again, strictly to the daytime side of the Earth, yet again posing the question as to how the moon is visible overhead dozens of degrees above the horizon when it should be 250,000 miles underneath your feet through the hypothetically spherical Earth. The next time you look up at the crescent moon and try to determine whether it should technically be visible according to its phase and the current time of day or night, in many cases, simple observations of the moon lead to the complete collapse and abandonment of the heliocentric theory if you would only just think about it. Or map it out, or animate it, or draw it out, or put it in a AutoCAD, or do whatever you got to do. But if you can see the full moon during broad daylight, which I can, and I've put it on YouTube, then the heliocentric model is wrong. If you can see such a full moon in broad daylight, keep track of it to see how late in the day it remains visible. One time when I did it, I think sunrise was at 7:30, and the full moon was visible all the way up to like 2 in the afternoon or something like that. It was ridiculous. 100% full moon. If you want to do these sort of experiments for yourself, try to map out the geometry of the situation, which is pretty simple. You're just dealing with the Earth, Moon, and Sun. You don't have to worry about the other planets or whatever, or the stars. Just dealing with the alignment of the Earth, Moon, and Sun. Simple geometry, and try to explain these very often observable facts in the heliocentric theory. Good luck. And with that, we wrap up section 1 of the top 5 reasons the heliocentric model falls flat on its face. And the next section that we're going to cover in video number 2 is going to be the North Star Polaris, which I've already done the recording for, just have to get the editing and rendering done, so it is in the works. In the meantime, I want to give a big shout out and thanks to all of my subscribers, all of my patrons on Patreon, and all of my supporters through PayPal. If you would like to keep this channel going, I'm dependent on you. So you can pledge as little as $1 per video through Patreon. And that link is www.patreon.com/themorgile. You can also support directly through PayPal to www.paypal.me/themorgile1. That's the number 1. Or a direct PayPal transfer to jonelance@gmail.com. So with that, God bless you all. Thanks so much for watching. Spread the word, spread the world, and peace.